Our guest speaker is Dr. Clarence Oliver, who for the last 16 years I got to work at his school. He's a veteran. He's also a colleague and a friend of mine, so I'd like to welcome him to our school today. Thank you.
Thank you. All you young people in the last few days have heard a lot about Veterans Day. Some of you may have been to the parade. Some have maybe been able to watch on television some activities celebrating this day. You've heard the name mentioned several times, but do you know anything about the holiday and the American veterans that it celebrates? What is this day? What is its history? When is it observed? What is its purpose? You probably haven't thought much about that, but let's take a little bit of time to talk about how we got to where we are with this unusual holiday and why we do it. Many years ago, there was a war that in the time that I was a young person your age and in elementary school, that war was called the Great War. In recent years, the name was changed to World War I. There had not been many wars during those days, and this was considered by people in leadership to be the war that was going to end all wars. Obviously, it did not do that. There had not been many wars of recent years during that time of the Great War. That war was ended in 1919 during a time that I was not quite born, but it was only 9 years before I was born and was made aware as I grew up and went to elementary school that I was aware of the fact that the Great War had great expectations that did not take place. The war officially ended several months before they developed an observance of the end of the war. The war officially ended in June 1919 when a treaty was signed by France. But in looking back at when the fighting had ended in that war, that fighting had ended several months before that. And when they were looking at signing an agreement to stop fighting, all the Allied armies agreed to stop fighting, and they were fighting Germany that had started the war wanting to take over a larger part of Europe. And eventually all the nations of most of the world became involved in that war that lasted for 4 years. The war came to an end when they signed an agreement on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the month of November. So it was an 11-11-11, and that came to be regarded as the time that the war ended. So in November 1919, President Woodrow Wilson, who was the President of the United States at that time, proclaimed that November 11th was to be the first Armistice Day, and that they would celebrate it in the United States. Then a few years later, in May 1938, Congress made November 11th as a legal holiday for our nation, and they set aside that day primarily to honor veterans of this great war that we now know as World War I. That was observed for many, many years, and in 1954, after the end of World War II and after the end of the Korean War, Congress was asked to amend that act of 1918 and to stop using the word armistice and to replace it with veterans. And on June 1st, 1954, November 11th became a day designated as a national holiday to honor American veterans, and it has continued since that time as Veterans Day. It's really a legal federal holiday, but the federal government sometimes changes when we observe some holidays, and in recent years they decided to observe many holidays on a Monday, and they designated a Monday holiday system so that all the banks would be closed on Monday rather than a date that wanders back and forth during a week. But Veterans Day had such a special heritage with the armistice, the 11th hour of the 11th month, of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, that people who were veterans and people who were enjoying history wanted to keep that day as the day that Veterans Day is observed. So in a week like we have this week, we have people observing Veterans Day on November 11, and then we have people observing Veterans Day on the Monday following November 11. That's part of the problem of trying to set dates on holidays, but it has been done. Other countries that were involved in that war also celebrate November 11 as either Armistice Day, or Canada calls it Remembrance Day. But the holiday is observed by many countries around the world. Now, a military veteran is a person who has served honorably, and we'll come back to that term in a little bit, honorably in a military unit but is no longer on active duty. A military veteran who has served directly in combat in a war zone is additionally described as being a war veteran or a combat veteran, and some of us have that designation, and we usually used to prefer that. Veterans then are men and women who have served in one of the nation's military branches, the Army, the Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, Marine Corps. And in recent years, we've had a newly established branch that hasn't yet found its way, the Space Force. They're developing how they're going to be organized and what all their duties will be. So there aren't any veterans from that group yet. They haven't had it long enough that anyone has retired or finished service from it. Sometimes that military service can be full-time in the United States. They don't have to be overseas to be in the military. Sometimes it's in peaceful areas in other parts of the world, and sometimes it's in an area that is involved in war, but they're in a unit that is not in war. They're in a reserve area where they're providing supplies and taking care of medical needs and mail service and all of those type of activities. Any of those where a person has been honorably serving on active duty for a period of time, when they leave that, they are veterans of that particular branch of service. At the present time, according to the most recent census studies, there are about 16 million living veterans in the United States. That includes veterans from World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Persian Gulf War, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and all the other locations that have been involved in smaller wars in what is now called the Southwestern Asia area. Used to be called the Mideastern states. But there are about 16 million people who have been in all of those wars that are still living. At one point there were about 24 million veterans that were living, but the World War II veterans are old and dying off, and so there aren't as many of those. But to give you an idea of how many people that constitutes, think a minute about a football stadium that is packed, and you look out over that, we'll multiply that by 500 football stadiums, and you have about the number of people who are veterans that we're talking about here. The majority of the veterans that are living now are those from the Vietnam War, and most of them are in their early 70s or in their 70s. There are a few in their late 60s, but most are in that age group. There are only about 165,000 World War II veterans still living. There are about 1.5 million Korean War veterans that are still living. And I'm in that Korean War group. Most of us are in our 90s, approaching 95. So that number will decrease soon, and it will be replaced by new, younger people who are going into veteran status after having served in some of the recent wars around the world. When I was your age and in elementary school, it was just a few years after this Great War took place. That was just 9 years before I was born, and 4 of my uncles were veterans of that war. All 4 were in combat. 3 were in the Army, 1 was in the Navy. I've always wondered what would have happened if I had had the nerve to have asked any of them about their experiences in the war. 1 lived next door to us. 1 lived across the street from us. 1 came home from the war. He was injured mentally by what we then called shell shock. He had been exposed to so many explosives that he never was able to get his mind functioning again. They have different names for those now, but at that time it was just shell shock. And one day he walked off the farm, the family farm, and was never heard from again. So we have 1 who has disappeared from society. He's probably deceased now because he was a World War I person, and they're mostly deceased. But 3 of those remain, and I could have asked them, tell me about your war experiences. Well, you need to do that. I hope that you are braver than I was if you have relatives in your family or extended family that you know were in the war of some type, or if they were in the service and not in a combat situation. Ask them to tell you about their experiences that they remember. Some may not want to talk about it. I know how that feels, but some will be willing to share. And those are stories of your family that really need to be preserved. You're a young person now, but they probably would tell you a little bit if you stopped and talked to them about sharing the information they experienced when they were in the war. If you have veterans in what you have as an extended family, aunts or uncles or cousins or people that you know that were in the service, make sure that you talk with them, and on this weekend or this week, take time to thank them and honor them for this special day that we call Veterans Day. For all of you from Sequoia Elementary School, the students and the parents and the faculty and staff and guests who are at your meeting, thank you for permitting us to talk a little bit about memories of Veterans Day.